Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me today. We have just premiered a MixCon Masterclass with one Dana Nielsen, an amazing Grammy-winning multi-platinum producer, engineer, mixer, and he took us through an entire mix for a major artist named Mount Joy. And I've got him right here, right now, to answer your questions after the premiere of the Masterclass. Dana, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Justin. Thank you so much for having me, and for everyone for tuning in and checking out the masterclass. It was so fun to do, and I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Sweet. Great to have you here. In case the background looks different than the masterclass you just saw Dana do, he's not at his home studio. He is now at the very famous Shangri-La Studios, which has been around for decades and is now owned by one Mr. Rick Rubin. And Dana is fortunate enough to have worked with Rick Rubin in that very studio. So good luck on your upcoming session there. I know you'll be holed up there for about a week. So what's that desk behind you? It looks like, is that an API or what? I can't really see.
It is. Yeah, it's a 70s API. It's amazing. I love this console.
Great.
It's gorgeous, and it
Nice.
really takes.
And those monitors as well, both the wall-mounted ones and the monitors on the desk. A lot of people won't be familiar with either of those. Can you tell us anything about the monitoring in there?
Yes. Well, the near fields, I bet many people will know, they're actually ATC 25s that are kind of customized specifically for Rick and Shangri-La in the white color palette.
Yeah.
And the whole studio, like out in all the, like I mentioned to you before, the live room is all original as it was in the 70s, but the areas out around the house, everything is very minimal. Everything is white, even the floors. It's a very I feel like you're walking through a cloud. It's it's very sunlit, and so yeah, it fits the vibe, and it's a fun thing that ATC does for the studio here. And then
very cool. I don't think I've ever seen any other ATCs in white before. I think that is my first pair.
So cool,
and it's interesting, Rick's vibe about he has this very kind of Buddhist Zen way of, interacting with daily life. And then you hear the music that he's involved in, and it's almost anything but that, the kind of creativity and emotion that goes into so much of this stuff. One of the things I love about Rick is he's so focused on, it makes sense that he's a fan of pro wrestling because he brings out like larger than life performances and kind of, I think, drives artists towards being the biggest, most unbridled version of themselves. And I think that's something I hear across his stuff. Like he just is like, no, be even more you, and it's interesting that you have to get very Zen maybe to get in touch with being able to do that.
Yeah, he's amazing. I love working with Rick. I'm actually not working with him on this particular project, although I hope to say hey. We've definitely worked on so many albums, and much of what I talked about in that masterclass is stuff I've learned from him. He's not a mixer or an engineer, but he listening to mixes by his side as we're going through the review process. Like I've learned so much about mixing from him based on his requests, like, the guitar needs to lift here. New things need to always engage the listener as say an outro section repeats, or so much about arranging and structure, different elements of a mix to tell the story and to support the meaning of the song and the artist's intention, and also very much that process of finding the core elements of the song and the performance and mixing from there. That's all from Rick. That was something that he has had me do from time to time over the years when he will have remembered something from the tracking session, and it was a stripped down genesis of the song and the performance. And, as we all do as creative folks, musicians, you get in the studio and you're inspired and you add all these amazing layers. And part of the fun of being a mix engineer is making space for all those layers to be meaningful. But when it comes back to him, sometimes it will be like, what is all this stuff that that was added?
Right.
I'm not hearing that essence anymore. So very early on, when I would be mixing for him, at times he would say, "Why don't you just mute everything, all the overdubs, mute it all, and just make that core mix of the basic tracks that were the start of that song. And then once you have that, he says, then you can pepper in what would be his words, then pepper in the overdubs. Make those overdubs support the great thing that you've built in the basic, what I call the basic mix. And that's really served me really well, and I love working that way. And it really is a fun way to honor the most essential parts of a song, and to also figure out afterwards what's really needed. I bet not
Mhm.
all of these overdubs are in fact helping. So yeah, it's a fun way to work.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, one of the biggest things I'm always trying to get beginning and intermediate mixers to start focusing more on is finding out what's truly important in the song and making sure that that is emphasized. And that was one of the first things you spoke to in your masterclass. I loved you took us through the track and basically muted down everything and talked about your idea of trying to make the song work with just acoustic guitar and vocal. And can we make it compelling that way? And can we not forget that that is the central core of the song? And as much as we love the kick drum and you loved the kick drum in that song, we want to make sure where the focus is. I also like the idea of muting things in the arrangement, because one of the things that you hear in Rick Rubin's productions and in just good contemporary pop production is that there's often what I like to call little scene changes every 7, 10, 14 seconds. And a lot of newer bands, newer artists, or just artists who don't arrange, they fall in love, so in love with the song, and they think it can just carry itself. And to a degree, it can. But really compelling record production is you hear these little switches of every 7 seconds, and you put in everything, including the kitchen sink from moment one. How is your intro going to develop? How is it going to get me
Right,
more interested at second 7 than it was at second 1? And I
right.
feel like I heard that in the Mount Joy arrangement, and I hear it in so many of the biggest records that you've worked on. And you've worked on a ton of big records. So, yeah,
Yeah.
let's get
Yeah,
into some of the
to that.
specific questions too from the audience. But yes, if you had anything to add to that, please.
Yeah, just real quick, I always say to that point, one of my favorite starting place as a mixer on a song or with a band, I love to just say, hey, this first pass, I if it's cool with you, I'd love to just take it wherever my heart leads me, wherever my ears and inspiration lead me. And even if that means I might, scoot aside some things for now, we can always come back to it. Anyway, so I'll kind of preface if the artist is cool with that, and it always works really well. I've never had that backfire, and it's a really
Mhm.
fun starting point for me to be okay with, like, maybe just I don't think we need this fourth guitar stack, because the
Mhm.
the first three are doing wonders. And you really can make more with less, and it becomes, and to your point, create much more contrast, maybe holding off on this amazing fourth guitar until the third chorus or something like that. I love that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. We had a whole bunch of questions come in during the live premiere and a whole bunch of questions coming in now. Just a reminder to you guys, this one is um, currently live, so you can type questions in the live chat and we will get to them. Also, we are giving away thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of free gear in the MixCon mega giveaway. So go over to mix-con.com. That's mix-con.com, where you can RSVP for all the other presentations coming up. We got one coming up with Andrew Sheps next week, which should be great. Preston Prizzy
My
Reed the week
buddy.
after that. Nico Bolas, whole bunch of people, some of whom Dana has worked with. I know you've worked on records together with Andrew Sheps. Red Hot
Many.
Chili Peppers come to mind, and others. Before we get into your questions, I want to lead with a question that all of the MixCon masterclasses are free to the public thanks to our sponsors. And the sponsor on this one was a natural fit. It is SonarWorks. So we were talking a little bit about monitoring here. You've got lovely ATCs there in Shangri-La. In your own home studio, you have a pair of ATCs, which probably cost in the excess of 5 figures. And yet you still use SonarWorks, which is a few $100s worth of software to improve those further still. When did you first discover SonarWorks for the Sound ID reference platform? And when do you start using it? And why did you keep on using it?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when, but I would say easily 10 years ago, maybe more.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned in the masterclass, I was very aware of the a couple of room frequencies that would resonate that I was constantly EQing out. Most notably 147 hertz, which is very specific, but it is like that note would light up when a singer or bass player or maybe an acoustic guitar would hit a certain note. It would be like, oh my gosh, that's so boomy. And I used to not realize it was my room, and I would EQ out a very, very tight, narrow bandwidth notch. Unfortunately, that happens to be a frequency that I don't necessarily miss in most instruments and when they build up and whatever. And so my mixes from before SonarWorks, I still will listen back and be like, phew, okay, I think it's fine. But once I started using SonarWorks with Sound ID reference, it was right there in front of me on the graph. Just proved what I was hearing, and then it took care of it for me. And so I didn't. Not only was it more enjoyable to listen without those or corrected for those room resonances in my specific room, but it meant that I didn't have to do work. I wasn't working against them, and so yeah. Even though I have there's the ATC 25s. I have those at home, but I mostly also work on the 45s, and they're phenomenal. I love them, but the Sound ID reference is the final touch for my specific room. And I'm very excited also to be porting that into, they have an integration with the Avid Matrix Studio, which is what I use. And so I'm really excited. I'll actually this week after this session be creating some new measurements using their calibrated mic and measurement software that will go directly onto the SPQ card in my Matrix Studio, which is
Very cool.
awesome.
It is so much better to have a hardware mounted EQ solution. I mean, it just makes it so much easier to switch between speakers. And I know that in your
Yeah,
room, you switch between some cheap boombox speakers as well as your ATCs. And
yeah,
that becomes easier. If you do headphone referencing, that becomes easier as
yeah,
well to have it hardware integrated. And also just
yes.
reducing potential latency, additional DSP stages, stuff like that. So,
Yeah, and very much. I mean, to your point, I'm constantly in the current software way where it's on my mix bus. I do have to remember if I go to headphones, turn it off, bypass it,
yeah.
or if I go to those little speakers. Someone asked a great question in the YouTube chat: do I measure and correct on those little speakers? I don't. So those are things, right? When I move now with it built into the hardware, in the monitor profile, it'll just not be applied to those
Right.
sources, which
Yeah, you
is
could have
really
it
great.
not applied. You also have now the option of applying probably separate correction onto the
Yeah,
boombox. But by the same token, if you've really learned that boombox inside and out and it
yeah,
doesn't really extend down to, but if it does extend down to 147 hertz and has that same 147 problem, then you
yeah,
may as well correct those too if it makes it even
yeah.
easier. But
But I am
sometimes we
excited.
can
I'm
learn a
not sure if
flawed
I
system really well.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I will correct for those, but what I am going to do is do my normal. If you see in the masterclass, whenever I have that Sound ID reference pulled up, the profile that I'm using is called like ATC no sub or something like that. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to measure with the subwoofer, which I use sparingly, and it's on a button. It's additive, but now that I can easily have different settings for different monitor configurations, I've built a 2.1 path that's separate that integrates the sub and the multi-channel Sound ID reference version. I don't do Atmos or multi-channel really, but for the 2.1, it's going to be great because I can have a separate, measurement for when I switch to the monitor path with the sub, which will be really cool.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, another quick question for you on the SonarWorks tip, which is that Sound ID reference is not the only tool of theirs that you use. To my understanding, in some of your work as a producer and composer and doing arranging, you've also used their voice AI tool. This is an interesting one that they've come out with more recently, and it's kind of like a vocal transformer. How do you describe this? How do you use it? And we'll ask about your thoughts about AI in general in a second, because we did get some questions about that. But what have you found voice AI useful for? And can you describe it to people who might not be familiar with it already?
Yeah, absolutely. I think most people are familiar at this point with the tools that are offered by places like Suno, or there's many others, and not just for creating full tracks, but for this sort of voice changing, voice manipulation, where you can upload some audio, pick a voice, download that audio, pull it into your session. It's kind of a pain in the butt, magical and wild as it is technology wise. When Sonarworks mentioned to me this voice AI, and that it would be a plugin, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
you guys have cracked the code. Thank you so much, because I don't love bouncing files and going to external website and downloading that whole thing. It's just bit cumbersome. So it's that same process, but it's all done within a plugin, and they keep releasing more and more voices that sound great. It is a process of, within the plugin, capturing audio and uploading it and rendering it, but it all happens seamlessly right within your DAW. So you're not leaving your DAW to do any of this stuff. And it's a way better way to work. And I use it all the time. Whether it's, I'd say a lot of this for the music work that I'm doing as a mixer or producer, or certainly an engineer, it doesn't really come up that often. But as a composer, songwriter, working with pitches and briefs, it is super helpful, because it allows me to, let's say, even like my wife Carissa, who's an incredible singer and vocal contractor, and she'll have a job, and these are very tight turnaround jobs. And so, even though we might have somebody booked to record remotely, or there's a session booked for next week, but I need to make a commercial, demo, or a film song demo with female voices and kid voices. And this is a way where I can sing all the parts. I can spend my time arranging and futzing around in the studio, getting the parts right, me singing all of it, which will be the guide tracks for the actual singers, but as an incredible way to make more realistic mock-ups. And other instances when, Carissa has sung a whole section of a song and she's unavailable, and there needs to be like a tiny little word change or two, or a little different performance, I can go in there and like sing it myself.
So you have
And
a
of course, with her,
model of your wife's voice for such instances.
yeah, yeah, we do all kinds of stuff like that, modeling, not for public, but like, it's so useful to have these tools, and especially built right into your DAW. It's like, it's really fun and wild. And of course, with like, in general, AI stuff and these tools, sometimes you'll do a process and it's like, well, it's obviously not the real voice or something like that. You might have to process it again or tweak. And I'm not speaking about voice AI by Sonarworks. I'm just in general, doing this sort of AI processing, but it gets better and better and better. And there's a debate to be made on both ends of the spectrum. Is this awful or is this amazing? And I think it's both in different scenarios. But for me, as a writer or producer, mocking things up as a tool to get gigs, real gigs that will hire real singers and stuff like that, it's really indispensable. Or to thicken things that are already there. It's really cool.
Do you have any yet general principles for where you think makes sense or is useful or is ethical to use AI, and where it wouldn't be? Do you have general thoughts on that, or is it too early to have come up with rules around it in your mind?
Well, for voice stuff specifically, or
AI
AI
in
music
general, I
and
was kind of branching out to, but if you want to focus on voice, that's fine too.
well, I think the voice stuff, it my favorites are when the voices sampled are being sampled in some sort of equitable way that pays that singer for their
Mm,
talent, either up front or in some type of royalty setup or something like that. And more people are hip to that and
hmm.
providing ways for that to work. And I think
Yeah.
that's a real unlock when where you'll get better and better, AI voice talent because like SonarWorks have add-on packs that you can buy that I think third party developers are making
Hmm.
with their own talent and stuff like that. Um, so I'm always thinking about that, and I'm very ethically aware and sensitive to, like I know I made an example of like me singing and putting my wife's voice on it. That's very specific where
Yes, you know
we've
your
had
wife is
this.
cool with it, or else you'd be in the
Yes,
doghouse, I guess. Yeah, so you have to
yeah,
face those
I
repercussions
don't.
immediately.
Yeah, I don't want. It's a very slippery slope, and
Yeah.
and certainly there are many people not exercising those ethics.
Hmm.
And a lot of
You
it
know,
for sake of comedy, but
it's funny. I'm
it
just
gets very
musing here, but I
serious.
remember there was a lawsuit with Tom Waits where I forget what luxury car company, whether it was BMW or Mercedes, wanted Tom Waits to sing on a car commercial. He's like, no, I don't want to do that. So they hired like a Tom Waits sound alike guy to do the commercial anyway, and to do a song like in the Tom Waits style. And they
Ooh,
didn't
that's saucy.
actually like take one of his songs, but they just tried to write a Tom Waits like song and have it sung like Tom Waits. And he sued them and won. And this was in
Yeah,
the, I
absolutely,
think, 2000s or the late 90s. So there are
absolutely.
potential legal concerns around sound alike. Sound alikes can both be a way around legal concerns and also a way into them. So I'd like to
Yes,
study the
a lot of
case
people
law
don't.
more around that because it's a fascinating, weird,
It
and evolving area.
it is, and we deal with it a lot, especially in commercial briefs where
Sure.
they've and especially if an agency or client like BMW or whomever have already reached out to a name like that, whether it's a band that they want to license or a voice or both in the
Mhm.
case of Tom Waits. Once that's there, it's a real dangerous situation if you don't get approval to make something along that path. There's
Mm.
lots of different clearances for that type of stuff. You work with a musicologist, you work with the agency and brand client to figure out, do you have the publishing rights? Do you have the master rights for the song? Do you have a sound alike rights
Mm.
clearance if you don't have the master? There's been instances where, an agency or brand has been like, we want this to sound. I know you've re-recorded the Jackson 5, song, and here it is fun for me as a mixer being asked like, we want it to sound just like the original. And you hire all these awesome players and it's really fun to recreate these sounds from the 80s or something like that and get it as close as you can. And you'll hear, behind you the like peanut gallery of executives and creative folks from the team like, make it more, this is awesome.
Mhm.
But you get into real trouble if they don't have a sound alike license for that stuff. And so
Interesting.
there's all kinds of legal ramifications that you have to be careful of.
Well,
And
fascinating stuff. I know that the people here are clamoring to hear more about the mixing end of it, so I'm going to steer us back there.
yeah,
But man, we could have a whole
please.
conversation about this end of things. So I want to start with some questions that came in during the live premiere, and then we'll switch to some of the new ones that just came in. During the premiere,
Cool.
Sergio asked, maybe I missed at the beginning, but does he receive the exported mix or the session with all the plugins running? And I think in this case with Mount Joy, you seem to have their full session with their plugins. Can you tell us what the norms are there? And I know that there are some mixers who will request like stems and wet and dry tracks, and some just want the session. What are your norms these days? What do you recommend and encourage? And is there more than one way of
Yeah.
doing it, even in your work?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Sergio, for the question. It's a great one. And in this case, the answer was both. It started with, I think I heard the rough mix first. And then, was like, yeah, this is awesome. I definitely want to work on this. And then the session, Pro Tools session, came thereafter. That's always the easiest for me
Mhm.
working in Pro Tools, uh, to have all that. Because if I don't want a certain type of processing, I can just bypass it or turn it off, and um, that's a really great way, preferred way to work. However, so many people don't work in Pro Tools, especially if they're producing themselves. A lot of artists prefer Logic or Ableton or any number of other DAWs. And when that's the case, I have some shortcuts, links on my website to help guide somebody. Like, here's what I would need if you can export in this way. Sometimes I don't always ask somebody to do everything wet and everything dry. I kind of like, explain in these links that, like, if there's something that you're really married to, that's maybe an amp simulation that you love, just send me the wet,
Mhm.
or some production element that you've developed that's a big, cool delay throw with W effects on it or whatever. Like, I don't want to recreate that, not because I'm lazy, but because it'll never be as cool as what you did. So, um, but I definitely, in other cases, like, drums and acoustic guitar and stuff like that, I definitely want the dry, or access to those options. And I'd say probably half and half, if I had to guess, come by way of Pro Tools versus dry wet stems in a folder uploaded,
Mhm.
type of thing.
Gotcha. All
Yeah.
right. Well, let's go to some of the live questions. And just so you live viewers, remember, if you want to see more of the premieres live and more of these Q&As live when they come out, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. It'll make it much more certain that you're going to see this stuff when it is live. So Paul Tucci writes in from Ithaca, New York. He says, I'm listening here from New York, and damn if the masterclass from Dana doesn't sound great through my SonarWorks corrected headphones. So, not exactly a question, but I had to read that one out loud anyway. Cold Acres here, listening
I
from
love it,
Melbourne,
Paul.
Australia. We got folks from all around the world. Tanner is here commenting on how much he likes Rick's production aesthetic. Paul Tucci writes in to say, once again, Dana's arrangement advice rings true to me. I'm helping my son's band mix their record and suggested that more guitar and louder is not always the sophisticated, creative way to emphasize the outro chorus. So that's an idea there. That is one of the most obvious things we can do to make our last chorus bigger than the other ones. Can we add even more layers of the guitar, and can we amp up guitars? That is probably, yes, the first thing that we think of. Can you give us ideas as an arranger yourself? What are some commonly overlooked ways for beginners to add interest to, say, a second chorus compared to a first chorus, or the back half of a chorus compared to the first chorus? What kind of things do you look to maybe mute in a first chorus or first half of a chorus to allow it to develop? Any thoughts there about some of the best elements to generally play around with and look for those kinds of
Yeah.
developments?
First of all, what up, Paul?
Mhm.
It's great to hear from you. And yeah, I'm always, for me, it always has to do with those basic tracks. Like, if it was just drums, bass, guitar, vocals, and there was a time when the song was recorded or written, that's all there was, and it was hopefully moving to listen to, even in that format. And I think of what happens if I'm producing, I might guide that performance. Like, now when we get to this second chorus, there's only one electric guitar at the moment. Like, what can you do instrumentally on the floor to move an audience just like you would live? Are you going to slightly turn up the output of your guitar? Are you going to kick an extra pedal on the pedal board? Are you going to strum and open up the muting on your strings with your fingers and let things ring out further, hit more strings? So a lot of this stuff hopefully comes at the point of writing or pre-production or production and is baked in. That's not always the case, but that's what I'll try to achieve both in the moment and after the moment, if I'm just mixing and wasn't there. And if those things, that's kind of what I was talking about, like with the basic mix. If I find that core bit, and you can kind of tell, like, what's the instruments that were played all the way through, and what are obviously kind of add-on supplemental overdubs to add to the party. Even in that basic mix, I'm going to do things to make that repeated chorus at the end feel exciting. Even with just that one electric guitar, it might be turning the bass up that gives more energy once that final, chorus repeat comes through. It could be riding the overdubs hotter. I'm sorry, the overheads of the drums. It certainly could easily mean boosting the volume of that guitar or sending that main guitar to an extra bit of effect of widening or some type of extra thing. I'm always trying to ring out the most drama from those fewest most important instruments. It just makes me work harder, and it makes me feel really good about those core elements. And then when I see like, oh, there are these other overdubs there, you don't need them as much, and they become that much more exciting because maybe you've muted them until that chorus repeat on the outro because you didn't really need it. You're getting everything you need up to that point without them. So yeah, I mean, those are some practical things that I'll do even on the basic tracks. Pushing the bass up, finding it. Usually I'm led to know which elements to push and feature based on what I hear in them and what's most interesting to me. When a bass player does a really awesome fill going into that last chorus, I want to hear that. And that's all based on your own taste. And that's the really fun creative part of mixing and producing. But when it comes to mixing, you're dealt the hand you got. These are the tracks you get. And I love finding those moments that speak to me that I want to shine, put a spotlight on for the listener, and set up the balance in a way, even if it's just a passing chord on a guitar thing, and whatever it is, the drummer goes to the ride and there's some like little Stuart Copeland ping 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 pings. I'm like, I love that. Let me give more of that. And yeah, it's really really fun. I hope that answers or helps.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. Try to think about mixes as not always being just static and finding little things that you can accent within a part. So it's not always about removing and adding parts. So as one opportunity, there's also the opportunity of having relationships evolve over time, which I hear in a lot of great mixes, including yours.
Yes. If I can add one
Please.
thing to exactly what you're saying, and this is another lesson, learned from Rick. Again, not a mixer, but a fan and a keen ear for what makes songs work. He'll often say like, or said once, and it stuck with me, like a mix moves, a balance is static. You can have a really good balance, a static balance of a song, and you can hear all the instruments and you can listen down to it. But real mixing is the moves and pushing things and bringing them back. And they don't have to be real obvious in like, you don't want to hear like, oh, the mixer's doing something wild, but it's my task as a mixer and the creative part of it to make it move with automation and really, because that's what brings the excitement, when you hear or feel these movements and contrasts that are not a static thing.
100%. And I think there's two things there. One, the idea of making actual moves that evolve over time. And second, even if the goal was only to balance, if you ever try balancing on one foot and then pay attention to what your foot's doing, it's actually moving a ton. Like if you stand on one foot right now, your toes, like you shift from one part to another, all to stay balanced. And even to get a vocal that feels like it doesn't move often requires a lot of little squiggly movements. If you've ever been in those positions where you say, I feel like the vocal should be a half dB up. No, a half dB down. And you try to make a static choice of should it be a dB up or a dB down? But it's like, no, you actually need to ride the vocal to give it the appearance of being so even to get to balance, you need to move. And then to get to exciting, you need to move even more. So
yeah,
really
that's a great analogy.
Brought that up. Beautiful. All right, so we've already kept you for about a half an hour here. Do you have time for just maybe there's 3 more questions here that are good ones I'd love to get to? You have time for a couple? All right.
Yes, please.
So
yeah.
Beautiful. So we'll try to get to one here from Kenneth Daniels, longtime viewer and listener here, writes in. He says, he's talking about a client of yours. I don't know if you worked on this record, but this is a client of yours. Kenneth Daniel writes in to say, Justin Bieber, Swag 2 is the album of the year for me. It seems really bare bones compared to other pop music. Are you finding a trend that artists are using fewer tracks these days? Or is the trend still 100 to 200 tracks, not including vocal layers? I'm going to spoil it a tiny bit by saying that I think that sometimes when we hear really spare sounding pop productions, there actually are like 100 or 200 tracks in them, even when they sound spare. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What are your thoughts there? Are you finding a trend towards more sparse and spare arrangements? And do you have any thoughts on that particular record?
Um, I'm not sure if I see it like a overarching thing. I know what you mean on that aesthetic, and it's always cool and fun. And I love Justin. It was so fun working on those sessions. I continue to work with him. He's just freaking amazing. Um, I don't know how to answer that, Kenneth, because Justin Colletti is right that even when things sound sparse, there might be, that's part of what's fun about like modern R&B production and stuff. There's all these little nuanced things, these little ear candy flavors, and they all take up tracks and end up, you're like, oh, it's still a big session. But it's true. I think, but I don't know if I'm like the person to call trend on that.
Yeah.
Another similar style album that I was fortunate to mix several songs on is like SZA's SOS, and there's some of that stuff feels sparse in that same style, but there's still lots of tracks in there, lots of different layers, and I love it. It's kind of two different things, two different challenges when you have lots and lots of tracks and layers in a dense production, and you need to make the best use out of all of them, and you also need to like make sure you don't just mute all of them, even though that's what I might do to find that core mix. They're all going to find their way back in some way, because that's how the record was produced and delivered to me, and it's equally another challenge when there are so few pieces to work with, so few textures and elements, to really keep it interesting, for one, and to also, each of those sounds is going to really be under the spotlight, and so they all have to work really well together and stand on their own, or with little little help. I hope that is helpful. I don't
Yeah.
have a super clear, definitive call on that.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, here's another question for you. This one is about vocals that are more on the dry side. And Mount Joy, we're hearing more of a very wet, characterful vocal. But Benj
Yeah.
asks, do you have any tips for dealing with flat sounding, overly dry vocals? Vocals that are meant to be dry, but want to have a bit more personality. He says, I've tried blending parallel chorus on just the high frequencies, subtle reverb tails to add a subtle wetness without making them wet. Are there any better things that I could be doing to help keep things feeling dry, but keep them from being flat and make them more interesting?
Yeah. I love a dry vocal. And I think the go-to things for me, some of which you already mentioned, and some of which are in that masterclass, like those subtle flavors that I always have at the ready, the dim D, or the type A UAD, the some sort of Dolby or oral exciter type of thing, sparingly can add some silky top. Usually when it's dry, the whole production tends to be drier, and it tends to be a more intimate, in your face type of production. Maybe not. I'm not sure what you're working with, but for me, those dry vocal techniques tend to be in like a folk, Americana, singer songwriter type of thing, and you really in those want to feel connected emotionally, very connected, and proximity wise, very close to the performer. And so, yeah, I'll try to do a lot of um, compression uh, to bring the vocal very focused. I often like a slow attack, fast release, um, uh, 1176 style, or even the RVox. It does a great job. And you mentioned reverb stuff. I think you're on the right path. I might do that little bit of that um, Dimension D style thing, the Dolby style thing. These are very subtle things, especially in headphones, that give a dry vocal, some space and kind of fairy dust on them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Another thing you can try is like a real subtle dark slap, or a short reverb with a pre-delay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
One artist that you've
What do
worked
you
with a
think?
bunch that maybe you've done more engineering for them than mixing for them has been Red Hot Chili Peppers, where I've definitely heard that kind of treatment, especially in sparse sections where we have Anthony Kiedis and he sounds really upfront and he's dry, but it's not just like raw dry. Like there's a sense of reality or realism around him without being conscious of the wetness. Particularly I'm thinking of Californication, in some of the sparser sections there. Any thoughts on a vocal like that? And if some of those same ideas come to mind, or if there's anything special about the way someone might approach Anthony?
Well, yeah, that was mixed by my friend Ryan Hewitt, and I was
Mhm.
there on those mix, or no, Californication. Shoot, I might be that might have been Dave Schiffman or something. I'm sorry, I'm going to
I'll have
screw
to
up
look it up.
the actual stats.
Yeah.
But in terms of like Anthony's sound, that is a usually a SM7, lots of compression, usually like a 1176 or something like that. And there again, that's a great, because he's a very powerful singer. A lot of
Hmm.
SPL, and
Hmm.
a dynamic mic works really great for that. Same with like certain hip hop artists and stuff like that. You can get a really punchy, clear, direct sound, usually 1073 or something like that. SM7B raw, it might sound a little dull or boring, but
Hmm.
I would say that too for the dry vocal question. Really EQing it beautifully with some excellent top end. 10K, 12K, maybe an air band on an NTI or something like that, or and similarly with the low end too. Not speaking about Anthony's vocal here specifically, but other things that I'll do. Um, Maybe try a little like our bass, or Voice of God by
Hmm.
Little Labs. Things to, without adding a bunch of like 60 cycles or something like
Right.
that, give this feeling of richness.
Hmm.
Kind of depends on what you're going for. If it's like a rich male vocal or something like that, or rich female vocal, or you trying to be very light and airy dry. But any of those tools, I'm always listening to the sound of that person's voice and the sound of the recording, and just trying to hype it in a
Hmm.
way with compression and other subtle effects where it doesn't feel overly hyped or overly reverbed. But you're on the
Yep.
right path, I think, trying little reverb, short reverb bits to see what works. But it's really tricky with reverbs, especially in a dry setting.
For
They very
sure.
quickly get fake sounding or
One
funny. So
other thing I have to mention, just because it came up last week in Brent Colatalo's masterclass, was he was showing on his vocal really subtle formant shifting, which kind of
hmm.
reminds me a little bit of that idea where you have like it's the opposite end of that idea. You're talking about like a high chorus or a dimension D, like
Mhm.
making, Foreman shifting something down. So it's this really low voice and then just adding a skosh of that gave it this kind of width
Oh,
and
I see.
honestly a weird sense of space without it being obvious that there is a Foreman shifting
Yeah,
vocal there. So
yeah,
another thought there. And one more thing for you. A Californication, that specific record turns out to be Chris Holmes and Jim Scott are the two engineers for
yeah.
mixing that I found quickly on that one.
That's great.
There could be
That
others
that
as
makes,
well. I know some of these records will have, multiple mixers. All right, I don't want to keep you all day. You've been so awesome and generous with your time so far. I'll see if I can get through just a couple more of these without taking up your whole day.
yeah, it's
Give
my
me
pleasure.
one second
I love
here.
this stuff.
Nice. We have also, I would say that Benj, who asked this question, I know he works on a lot of hip hop, and you definitely have hip hop clientele and R&B clientele in your discography there. Do any of
Mhm.
these approaches you've just made change for the hip hop world, or are there any additional mixing tips or piece of advice you give for people who are in the hip hop genre?
I tend to use a lot of the same tools for the like key components, the key sound, the EQ, um, the magic fairy dust, whatever. I
Hmm.
think in hip hop and modern like R&B pop, you can push those tools a little further.
Hmm.
You could I might send more to like a hype machine, like a Dolby. I might I might use a bit more stereo widening stuff, or a bit more effect, effect sends, more aggressive, interesting, flamboyant kind of reverb tails and things like that, as opposed to mixing in a more acoustic based genre, folk or Americana or something like that. The Mountjoy is a great blend of that because it has those kind of folk Americana roots, but it really dips a toe. You can tell musically, like nobody explained this to me, but you hear the music and it feels kind of experimental and a little bit psychedelic, and so that kind of pushes at least my ear in a certain direction. But I would say, yeah, for hip hop stuff, I tend to be using not different tools, but maybe pushing them a bit harder, because you can, and because it feels right for the genre. Whereas other acoustic uh, genres, I'm using those tools, but I don't really want the listener to know that I am.
Hmm.
They do
Hmm.
something for me, and they solve a problem, but they're not really used as an effect,
Yep.
per se.
Totally understood. We have another possibly familiar name writing in here. Carissa Nielsen says, "Thank you for the compliments,
Ooh,
Dana. This is so awesome. Wow, all this incredible info." So you have at least one fan out there. We know there's many more, but she also says she enjoys AI voices for, especially for inspiring, for writing, for commercials and spots, and always replace them later with humans. Just like Dana mentioned, they're wonderful for mocking up vocal parts for human singers. So this is another way to think about using AI, not always as a replacement, but as a sandbox and as a playground, allowing you to experiment with things that you
totally.
couldn't otherwise. And I think that's a potentially great use. Um, just a couple more here, and we'll let you go. I want to see if I can do a lightning round here. Robin Guin says, you mentioned that after mixing your low end on the your realistics are your cheap boombox speakers, you check your low end there and leave some bass overload. You leave some bass overload in the mix. How do you handle it on the ATCs without messing up that balance? So let me see if I can reframe this or rephrase this. You said something along the lines of you check your bass instrument levels, kick and bass on your cheap boombox speakers. You're not
Yep.
adjusting the low end on them there, you're adjusting the level. And then you take them back
Right.
to the ATCs to figure out if there's now too much low end in them now that they're at the right level. Is that a good way
That's
of
right.
describing it? Is there anything you'd add to that process to make it more clear or give advice to people who are trying to do the same?
No, that's essentially it. Same with the bass guitar or 808s and things like that. Yeah, I'll move over to those little speakers and get the fader right. I might discover, like, oh man, these little speakers are blowing up. There's probably a little too much low end. I might do some EQ over there,
Mhm.
but the real thing. And I'll definitely mess around with harmonic saturation and things that that are going to help it speak on little speakers. A lot of times the harmonic stuff, like I love using Saturn or so many other like tube saturation or different distortion plugins. There's so many that I use to get like a bass line. Those harmonics end up making an 808 that's really like, 30 hertz feel like 60 or 60 feel like 120 or something like that, and that's what helps those translate on smaller speakers without losing the low end. So you're exactly right. That's my process. I might play with some of those harmonic things to get it to speak and with level. Mm-hmm. And then, just like you said, when I switch back to the ATCs, maybe I even turn on the sub and see what's going on. And it's like, holy crap, that's way too much low end. And then a real easy thing to do would just be adding a high pass filter. And as an experiment, you could do a high pass filter that's very steep, and you're back on those full range speakers, sweep it until the problem goes away. Yeah. Not that you're going to leave it there for to be finished, but like just verify, the issue I'm hearing is below here. And then you can switch back to the little guys and be like, it still rocks over there because they're not producing that anyway. And then you can switch back and forth and be like, okay, I don't want to lose everything below 50 hertz because there's some good stuff down there. But by sweeping a really steep filter up to 50 hertz and beyond, I know now that what I need to do is just figure out the best use of this information below that. And it could be some shelving, it could be some high passing, could be some, dynamic type of EQ or multiband or something like that. But at least now you've got the range and you've got your volume set. And now it's more like how much low end below that frequency can I get away with bringing back in?
This is so important, Dana. I love everything that I'm hearing here on this one. I just want to reinforce it slightly because it is something that I run into as a mastering engineer. People who send me great mixes have figured out exactly the kinds of things you're talking about. And one of the common problems I notice in mixes from people who feel like their low end isn't working is sometimes I'll be listening on something full range, main mastering speakers, even a pair of headphones that go really low like these where I can hear down to 40 or 50 hertz. And on the full range speakers, I'll be like, okay, I understand where you want your bass and your kick in the record. The problem is there's way too much bass and kick, too much low end in your record. Like compared to every other record you love, you're up like 3 dB below 100 hertz. So once we take down the low end to make the record sound appropriate and like an actual record, now your kick and bass levels are gone and they're nowhere near what you wanted. But if you instead decided what's the right level for the kick and bass on the smaller speakers where you can't hear the low end, you got them to sit right there and you did that first, you'd be like, okay, I know this works everywhere. Now you fold to the big speakers and go, whoa, it's that loud? And the wrong choice that people will make is like, oh, clearly they're too loud now. I need to turn them down. And then you switch back to the small speakers and they're gone. But you can have the best of both worlds. All you have to do is get the balance right, like you said on the small speakers. Then when you fold up to the big one, say, wait a second, the level is right. The only problem is that there's too much low end. I don't need to turn them down. I need to turn down the bottom end. And I think beginning and intermediate mixers are surprised by just how much low end they have to cut to make their low end sound actually huge and translate. And you have figured out a process that 100% makes sense for that. And that what you're talking about is what I encourage so many people to do. And I'm glad to hear it out of your mouth, because I think you're even more credible than me when it comes to this sort of thing. So thank you for saying it and showing it. So,
I love it. Happy to help.
Good. All right. I think last one here in the lightning round we're going to have to hit is we have more questions coming in, but I think these are the last two that we can talk about here. Sergio, this one piggybacks on kind of the last question. He says, hello from Portugal. Any tips on dealing with low end in the master bus? The low end for me is very difficult to translate on all speakers. Congratulations on the very good content, Justin. Okay, so basically he's talking about this low end, this idea of overloading low end. I think you just addressed with this idea to solve 90% of low end problems where the master bus is overloaded with low end. Is there anything you'd add to all of this when coming to think about low end in the master bus specifically?
Well, you need to allow plenty of space for it. Like it's going to eat up the most energy. And that kind of goes back to um, where I'm finding the drama and looking at my master meters without any like limiters on it, the true like incoming metering, and to give myself plenty of headroom. If you really want super, super, super lows, it's going to have to be kind of quieter across the board, much like printing to vinyl. It's like you're going to need more space for all that booty, just the physics of it work that way. And what I'm always trying to do, what we're always trying to do as mixers or mastering engineers is have all of it. I want my cake and eat it too. You find these sort of compromises one way or the other. Is the record going to be a little quieter to get this extra depth that I really want? Or am I going to lose a tiny bit, or not lose maybe, but lower a tiny bit of the deep, deep low end to get a louder record? And what I always try to do is try to figure that stuff out before getting into limiters and your end result, because the limiters are going to have the hardest time with that low end as well. So that's why I find the drama, and I get all my basics together without dynamics on the master. I will do some dynamics and harmonic shaping on a submaster for just the kick or 808 or whatever. But I want to hear and meter that true full frequency. You're the only person who's going to get to hear it this way. And I kind of relish that. I'm the only person who gets to just turn their volume up really loud and hear this mix, full bandwidth, no compression, no limiting. That's going to start out quiet in this whispery little intro, and by the end of it, it's going to like rip my head off with just concert level loudness. And unfortunately, we don't, at least in rock and pop and hip hop, we don't deliver stuff like that. It wouldn't be competitive. Maybe someday, and obviously that's what
people driving in their cars would complain. Not until we have like completely sound isolating automobiles could we get away with it.
Yeah. I'll give you one example of Damian Rice. Working with him, he really wanted my favorite Faded Fantasy is the album that I mix, and he was very adamant. Like he wanted that whole kind of orchestral style dynamic range. So there's one that I mix that does have that. And it is cool. It's really exciting. It is a journey like listening to classical music, which isn't leveled out for that type of experience. But it does, as you think it's a pop, or not pop, you think it's sort of a folk acoustic thing. He's singing real quietly in the verses, and you turn it up and you're vibing out at home or in the car. And man, by the time it gets to the end, it's like, oh my gosh, it's crazy,
Yeah.
But that's not the norm, So I try to get all that stuff together and have fun with it in full bandwidth mode, including working on the little speakers, figuring out the low end. And then once the mix is really together, then it's a matter of doing some of those, what do we call them? When you can't have your cake and eat it too, you kind of make those
making
decisions.
compromises, they call it. For sure.
Yeah.
It's funny, sometimes I've been in the car and I like to listen to classical music, and especially if it comes on something uncompressed, like Spotify or something where you're hearing the full bandwidth of it. It'll almost always happen that I'll be listening to a piece and like I've got the volume in a good place, and then the volume will start to get way quieter. and then people start talking. And my wife, who's a classical musician who should know better, will start talking, and then it'll get loud. And she's like, "Oh, this music is too loud. I can't." And it's like, this is the loud part. This is classical music. This is how it works. You play this stuff live. This is how it works. And people just aren't used to that. And as soon as it gets quiet and it starts to get buried under the road noise a little bit, people feel like it's time to talk. And then they're so amazed when it's like, how is this louder than me all of a sudden? And most people, seeing that even my classical musician wife isn't always prepared for that, the average music listener would actually really be annoyed, I think, if you went full dynamics on them, as much as us audio snobs like to pontificate about the beauty of extreme loudness. It is inconvenient for the way that people usually consume music in their daily lives. And it does take a special, like you said, sitting down on the nice speakers in a quiet room, and that's the main dish. And it's not the side dish to conversation or something else. So, yeah, it's a different type of listening. All right, the last question I have for you here, Bernardo Reyes has made it. He's so diligent about trying to make it to every masterclass premiere and every Q&A, just so he can ask everyone the same question. And the same question he is insistent on asking everyone, and I have to hand it to him. He's done this year after year now. He wants to know, Dana, what is your favorite sandwich?
Ooh. You know...
There's a look of sheer glee.
Pure glee. I love sandwiches. It's a great question.
We asked the right guy.
And I'm going to just go with what first popped into my head. This is not pre-thought of. I don't have a stock answer for this wonderful question. Yes. Rubin.
I knew you were going to say Rubin. I had Rubin in my head. I wish I wrote it down and had it up. For some reason, the look of glee on your face made me think it had to be something decadent like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Corned beef, the sauce, the toast, crunch. Oh, man. Yeah. But that's just what popped into my head, probably because we're in Rick Rubin's house. That might be a little subtle. I wasn't thinking that way, but... maybe that's why I successfully guessed. I promise this is true.
I mean, you have to take my word for it. But I was like, he's going to say Rubin. And possibly it's because you're in Shangri-La right now, which is owned by Rick Rubin.
Very, very possible. Another favorite here locally. Uh-oh. Huh? I don't know what's playing now.
What's that? Happening? You're hearing music on your side or something?
What is happening?
Well, we're okay here. I don't hear anything coming through on my side.
I'm just trying to delete every. I don't know what's.
All right. Well, while you're figuring that out, I will say bye to everyone, and thanks so much to you, Dana Nielsen, for being here. It has been awesome to have you for this whole live Q&A. You've been so generous with your time. The masterclass is awesome. You guys should check it out. And you should go over to mix-con.com. That's mix-con.com, where you can RSVP for more of these presentations that are coming up. And you can enter the MixCon Mega Giveaway, where we are giving away thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of free gear with 3 chances to win. Also, big shout out and thanks to SonarWorks, making some of the coolest stuff for both vocal replacement in the sense of voice AI, voice changing, and their tool they're probably best known for, Sound ID Reference, which will EQ the bejesus out of your speakers in studio until they sound more gooder and help you make better sounding choices. Dude, Dana, thanks again so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. And I love this topic and this community and what you're doing, Justin, and SonarWorks. Thank you. Freaking amazing people and software. And sorry about that little snafu there at the end. I really apologize if you were hearing my computer go haywire. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you guys for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop with Dana Nielsen. See you next time.